see your pensive look on the screen. Hello, hello. Check, check, check. Delicious and nutritious. Ooh, ooh.
What if I do this? Can you hear now? Do I sound substantially louder or quieter than Austin does?
Testing, testing, testing.
I'm also going to have to add my camera. Austin sounds quieter. Okay, we will turn the Chrome audio up. Love that. We're going to add, for whatever reason, my camera's just not capturing on Google Meet. So we're just going to we're going to turn my camera off. Oh! She's real big. And then we're just going to do this.
Not all
we're going to throw this
this.
here. And then we're going to slide that back behind the overlay like a pro. Yes! And I'm also going to flip it so it looks like I'm looking at you. We are professionals.
All right.
Are we good now? Chat, let us know. Cat, kitty, cat, cat, cow. I can't wait for you to have better internet.
Is it bad?
I mean, she's crunchy. She's crunchy. I can hear you fine.
Well, I did say I wanted to wait till we moved to start, but here we are.
Okay, well, you didn't say that when I asked if you wanted to do it today, so here we are. Here we are. Carrie to the Ethernet cable, that's right.
Not carry to the Ethernet cable. Well,
let's try it. Well,
anyways.
Welcome to episode 1 of Carrie to the Polls, featuring myself, Carrie the One. I use he, she, they pronouns. I don't know why I could not think of that word to save my life. You all know who I am. I'm a drag queen here on the internet, not in drag right now. And we're here to talk about some politics. So let's start first, because I didn't really set up anything with Austin in terms of like what level of information we're sharing about ourselves. So I'm going to allow Austin to introduce himself and choose how much or how little you'd like to disclose.
Okay, well, everyone on stream pretty much knows me. I'm the, very annoying politico in our little community. I have run for office a couple times, so I think that's what Carrie is getting at with her, how much information I choose to share. So politics outside of Twitch is kind of where my circles lie, is very much politics, how I spend a lot of my time outside of Twitch. So I love being engaged in politics and talking about this kind of stuff and trying to stay informed and help other people stay informed. And I'm also the youth critic for the Green Party of Alberta. So one of my big focuses is helping young people in particular become more engaged and involved in politics.
Love that. I wasn't sure how specific you wanted to get about how you're involved politically. So you just flat out were like, this is what I do. Here's the party. Here's where I live.
This is what I do. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. I remember once upon a time, those of you who might remember, it was very like hush hush, and we would speak in code about what Austin does. And now he literally can give two shits. So
yeah,
here we are.
Mm-hmm.
We like the captions.
It's me.
So we're using Google Meet. It's a little bit clunky in terms of kind of the back end of stuff, but I think once we get it up and running, the captions generally are a lot better. So we love that. So this is episode 1. We have our tea or other beverage of choice. And so obviously we're going to kind of figure out as we go what this is going to look like. I think for me, it makes sense to kind of just pick a topic, something kind of broad, and just kind of go from there. I don't want to get like too scripted. 1, because I know we're not going to do that. 2, I think sometimes when we have these conversations, the beauty of them, or where the learning can really happen, is when people are able to just kind of ask questions and go there. So I don't want to make it too structured, but today we're talking about Miss Freedom Convoy. Y'all may have heard about it. We're going to start. So, in terms of kind of like format, I do have kind of a little timeline to share. By all means, please feel free to fill in as someone who lives in Canada. You probably hear a lot more about this than I do. So, I'm just going to share for those of us who maybe it's the first time you're hearing about this. Maybe you've only heard a little bit about it. I know for me, before doing some of this research, I had a vague idea of what it was, but I didn't really know like what are the central kind of concerns. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of what is the Freedom Convoy? How did we get here? And then from there, I think the questions will turn into kind of like, what is the impact here? What is the ripple effect that we're seeing, that we've already seen? What does this mean for the future of similar movements that we're already seeing in other parts of the world? So let's just get right into it, shall we? Let's do it. So I guess really the timeline here starts, I would say around January 15th, which would be when this federal vaccine mandate was issued in Canada. So this is a mandate that required unvaccinated truckers returning to Canada to quarantine for 2 weeks and then provide a negative test before they could go back out on the road. Some points to remember here and some things to note that I think sometimes get lost in the shuffle when folks are talking about this is this only applied to unvaccinated truckers, which if we're looking demographically speaking, that's a very small percentage of truckers. So we're talking about a very small portion of this industry. And since then, the United States has also had a very similar mandate put in place so that even if this particular mandate didn't exist, the fact that one exists in the United States would have essentially the same kind of effect where it would prevent people from being able to go back and forth as often as they might want to, only if they're unvaccinated. It looks like the convoy itself in its original form, I think it's certainly evolved into something totally different since then, but started in British Columbia, January 23rd, when this group of truckers from British Columbia set off for Ottawa, which is almost all the way on the other end of Canada, specifically to oppose this mandate. And I keep pointing that out because, again, what you're hearing now is, I think, so different than what this kind of started as. And again, remember,
it's evolved so quickly that it's kind of even hard to keep track of.
yeah, which is what these movements tend to do. I see a lot of people comparing it to the January 6th insurrection here in the United States. Mm-hmm. There's some choices made there, I think, but similarly, that started as a very specific movement that very quickly became much broader and less focused, I think, as more people became part of it too. So it's also worth noting that generally speaking, this mandate was pretty widely supported in Canada. It had pretty strong support. It wasn't like this was a mandate that the government kind of forced through that people didn't want. Broadly speaking, folks support mandates like this for unvaccinated folks. Fast forwarding to January 29th, that's when the convoy reached Ottawa, correct? That sounds right to me.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Numbers are kind of... it's hard to know how many folks were part of this. It depends on who you ask. So official numbers are that there were somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 vehicles. Very important to note that we're not just talking about trucks. So we're not saying that there are 1,000 to 2,000 truckers. It's 1,000 to 2,000 vehicles. Many of them are just random folks that kind of joined in with their cars. If you ask them, they will say it's closer to 30 to 40,000 or more. You can decide what you want to believe when it comes to that, I guess.
Right.
And at this point, that's when we really started to see kind of this expansion of what this was all about. So at this point, we're starting to see folks who are just kind of more broadly opposing mandates in general. So vaccine mandates for everybody, mask mandates, some folks who just specifically oppose Justin Trudeau specifically, and also a lot of folks with some concerns about inflation, which is a big problem right now in Canada and probably around the world. I think we're all feeling a pinch right now, but Canada in particular is seeing some of the highest inflation they've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. Fast forwarding to February 7th. So at this point, the truckers and their friends or their supporters, this convoy is in Ottawa, and it's essentially, it's like an occupation of sorts where they're just kind of camping out and deciding we're not leaving until you give us what we want. So by February 7th, the mayor of Ottawa, Jim Watson, has declared a state of... Are you impressed with how much I know about this and the names?
Yes,
Hello.
actually.
My friend Jim
Yes, I'm
Watson,
very
the mayor of
impressed.
Ottawa, said, this is I've had enough, and we're ready for this end. So he declared a state of emergency in Ottawa. Around that same time, a GoFundMe that had been created for these protesters was shut down. GoFundMe determined that this link and this fundraiser violated their terms of service, even though it had already raised about 10 million Canadian dollars, which is like $5 American, but it's fine. So GoFundMe shut down this fundraiser, and it's since moved to some other website that has come out and said we are not going to shut down this link. Courts have already like frozen the money, and it's a
Mhm.
whole thing. But this new website has said we're not backing down on this.
Right.
The last information I have, and I know Austin's been sending me links and pictures and stuff. A lot's happened in the last couple of days in particular, but as of February 10th, similar protests have now started to arise in Finland, in Australia, New Zealand, France, and there are folks who are planning. We'll see whether or not or how this kind of manifests a similar protest in the United States, moving from California,
Mhm.
hypothetically this weekend with the Super Bowl in LA, all the way across the country to DC, all with similar kind of vibes. We'll say this kind of like take back our country. We're not going to let the government take our rights away anymore. We are the people and we're fed up. But also similarly, I think these are relatively small minorities of the folks in these places who are just particularly vocal. So that's kind of the general. Here's how we got here. Again, I know that it's evolved a lot since yesterday, frankly, and there's still a lot
Mhm.
going on. So first and foremost, where so we have folks in Ottawa, but we also have people blocking bridges in a couple places too. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. The two I know of are in Ontario, the Ambassador Bridge, and then also the Coots border in Alberta are the two biggest ones I think happening currently.
Great. And so these are places where they've just kind of parked their trucks and
Yeah,
they're just
to
not
just
letting people
block the
through.
border. Yeah,
Okay.
for this pretty much all the same reasons that people occupied Ottawa. It's public health restrictions, mandates, vaccines. These are all the reasons that they're giving, anyways.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So what is it that they want now? I guess is what would make them go away and stop? Do we know? Is there like an
Whew.
organized these are the people who speak for us, or is this kind of a
I don't think so. I think it's evolved so much that there's so many different I think there are so many different organizers even that have different ideas of what this protest is about,
Mhm.
who've all kind of co-opted each other's movement. But I think that the biggest kind of overarching message is they want an end to public health measures in general, public health restrictions, no matter what that looks like, whether it's restrictions, exemptions programs, or vaccine mandates. They kind of want an end to, I guess, even you could say the end to the pandemic.
Well, I mean, don't we all?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have, like I said earlier, I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos, which I know isn't always the best place to get your information, but it feels like the people that
Sure.
folks are bringing on for these interviews are just like folks they've plucked out of this protest to be spokespeople, and it doesn't feel like there's really like a structure
No,
to it
there's
or
no.
anybody who's kind of trying to organize things, and it's all just these angry people who are like, well, fuck
Right.
Trudeau, and we want. To get back to work, which is interesting. That the whole thing is we want let them go back to work, but then they're literally
Stopping other
stopping
people
work
from
in
working.
order to make that point. So
Right.
yeah,
And that's like the sad part is that a lot of, I would say, maybe everyday people are getting roped up into, the notion that this is like a working class movement of everyday Canadians when I personally don't think it is, but they are kind of getting, like I said, roped into that narrative, which is very frustrating in a way.
sure.
Um, like I don't know any working class people that could quit their jobs and go occupy downtown Ottawa for a month,
Hmm.
Like you don't nobody has that kind of time. So who are these people and what really is their end goal is hard to parse out when what they're doing doesn't really match the message that they're trying to get across.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny that, and I'm maybe stereotyping or overgeneralizing, but I think generally a lot of time the folks who engage in these types of protests are people who would oppose more kind of socialist policies, but they're
Sure.
also generally sustaining themselves off of things like GoFundMe's and crowdfunding
Right.
and like mutual aid, whether or not that's what they want to call it. So
Right.
it's very interesting that the shoe fits one way but not the other.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I had heard a lot too about. I guess specifically the Ambassador Bridge situation is really impacting the auto industry apparently, which
Yeah.
was just kind of starting to get back on its feet after the initial kind of pandemic stuff hit, and now because this is the place where it's the crossing between Toronto and Detroit, correct? That's kind of the like
Yes.
main interchange here.
Not Toronto. Windsor
Windsor,
and
Windsor,
Detroit.
Windsor, right,
Yeah.
right. Um, so that's where a lot of this international trade is happening, and so it's interesting that these folks are, oh, you're keeping our truckers from being able to do their jobs and feed their families, while simultaneously we see these plants are shutting down because they don't have materials. There are already how many different shortages that are impacting all the different manufacturing sectors, and now
Right.
this. So it's just interesting what we'll accept in terms of the price or the sacrifice for getting our point across.
Right.
Um, that
I guess
people will,
the effectiveness of the chosen form of protest doesn't really make sense
yeah,
in reality.
yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting how people will channel their anger, um, and convince themselves that this is an effective use of their time energy. And of course, people can protest how they want.
Right.
And even the leaders in Canada have said, like, you're allowed to make your point. The issue is that now you're harming other people. This is interfering with other people's livelihoods,
Right.
and that's the problem.
And this kind of gets into the biggest frustration for me because there is sort of a double standard in the response from our elected officials and the police and the RCMP and how they respond to these protests versus, say, maybe a Black Lives Matter protest or, land defenders for Indigenous rights. Um, we've seen protests very much like this from other groups where they get shut down within hours by militarized police,
Mm-hmm.
but all these white privileged people in trucks are allowed to occupy downtown Ottawa for 3 weeks at a time or shut down a bridge between two countries.
Mm-hmm.
um, and the injunction for the Ambassador Bridge was served just last night. I think it was like 7 p.m. And the police were handing out little pieces of paper that they probably just printed at the local precinct saying, if you don't leave quietly in the next little while, then we're going to have some major consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's not something that would happen at like a Black Lives Matter protest.
Right.
Nobody would give us a little piece of paper to say, "Can you please quietly go home?"
Mm-hmm.
You know. So it's been very frustrating.
Yeah, and I guess my question would be then, like, the argument, at least here in the States, is that the Black Lives Matter movements have been violent ones, and that the protests
Hmm.
are destroying property and people are getting hurt. Are we seeing that with
Sure.
this protest as well? Is it staying largely civil, or are we seeing
Well,
people burning shit?
I think that's interesting that we're asking that today because there are countless counter protests happening all across the country, literally right now.
Mm-hmm.
In like every major city, there's counter protests happening. So I think maybe even by the end of today, things could heat up as kind of the two ends of this spectrum meet finally.
Mm-hmm.
I've been seeing pictures on Twitter of, counter protesters blocking the convoys that are trying to move through the city, and that's creating some tension, I think. So we'll see how that goes. I think generally it has been fairly civil, but I think that depends on like what your definition of violence really is. Like, is violence
Sure.
fully physical violence, or is impeding someone's livelihood also a form of violence?
Right. 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 So it sounds like it's getting worse, not better. This has been bubbling for a
Yeah.
while now, and it sounds like it's escalating. So nobody's leaving. They got this injunction. They've been told you have to leave. Nobody's leaving, is what I'm hearing.
um as far as I can tell so far, yes, that's the case.
Okay.
um and it's different in different provinces because they all have different rules, but
Mm-hmm.
there's kind of an interesting storyline here for Alberta. They closed the border between Montana and Alberta, the Coots blockade. Um, in June 2020, Alberta passed a bill called the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and this was in response to the Wet'suwet'en rail blockades that happened all across the country. They wanted to create this bill to kind of define what is critical infrastructure, what you can and cannot block if you're in protest, and have like stricter fines for blocking these. Um, and they have not so far enforced this bill that they passed in response to a largely left wing protest.
Mm-hmm.
They have not enforced it on a very much right wing protest. And so we're seeing kind of this like double standard from the government. And they've even caved to some of the demands because just this week, the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, announced that we are stopping the restrictions exemption program, which essentially barred any unvaccinated person from going to restaurants, movie theaters, all that sort of stuff. And literally at the drop of a hat, he said, as of midnight tonight, we're ending this program. And that was in a direct attempt to get this blockade at the border to stop because that was their major demand.
Hate that. And
Yeah.
I think there are several other provinces have made similar moves where they're kind of
Right.
rolling back some of these restrictions. Um, that's so frustrating.
Yeah.
So,
So I would say that they are very much succeeding actually in their goal.
mhm.
Um, Insofar as in what governments are able to do, I think they are succeeding.
Great. And of course, they're spreading the message, and now we see it happening elsewhere too. And it's interesting that it.
Right.
And I don't have a complete list of the other places where these types of protests have sprung up, but it
Right.
seems like it's a lot of generally more progressive places. You know, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, it's France, Belgium, Finland, Scandinavia, where it's supposed to be this like
Right.
liberal paradise and this haven for progressivism. We're seeing these types of protests popping up.
Right.
What are the kind of right wing conservative, I don't know if that's the language that you use in Canada, but the right wing folks who might maybe more idealistically align with these folks, what are they saying?
I think it's a mixed bag because there are a lot of conservative politicians who are trying to capitalize on this movement and kind of earn the votes of the people who are either directly involved with the protests or who support the protests. But then there are also, I think, a good contingent of conservatives, we'll say, maybe in the Conservative Party specifically, who recognize the double standard and don't want to get caught on that side of it as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so I'm seeing kind of both from different politicians. Um, there's one of note. His name is Pierre Polyev. He is a front runner for the conservative leadership, and that essentially means that he's kind of one rung on the ladder down from being a contender for prime minister. So he's a very important person in Canadian politics right now. And in June 2020, when the rail blockades were happening for the Wet'suwet'en protests, he said, and I have his quote here, so I'll just read it out. Quote, you have the right to swing your fists, but that freedom stops at the tip of another person's nose. These blockaders are taking away the freedom of other people to move their goods and themselves. That is wrong, and the government has laws and tools in place to combat it. So he said that about the rail blockades for the Wet'suwet'en, but now he is in full support of the occupation of Ottawa and both of the border blockades because he's trying to capitalize on the votes of these people that he knows will most likely vote for him.
Right. Oh, that's so gross.
So it's this like full double standard from these conservative politicians that want these votes, but who have said in the past about similar protests, just maybe they're more left-wing protests in general.
mhm.
Very
Gotcha.
frustrating.
So, because the Conservative Party, they just kicked out their guy, right? I remember reading something. O'Toole, they just got rid of him,
Yes.
right? What happened with that?
Yes.
Was that because of
Yes.
this, or was that just kind of like a long time coming? He just
I think
lost.
there was a lot of going on there, but I think this kind of it boiled over because of his response to the convoy in general, and he took the more he did support them and he went out and met the occupation, but he was also very firmly on the side of the government at large, saying you have to go home, you have to stop this, this is not right. And I think a lot of the conservative caucus disagreed with that, and so they promptly voted him out. Um, he's been a more moderate conservative, so he helped pass the conversion therapy bill that outlawed conversion therapy, and he essentially forced the entire conservative caucus to vote for the bill, which was very controversial on their side because half of them didn't agree with it. So for many reasons, he was a more moderate conservative, and it was kind of a long time coming, but this event definitely kind of had it boil over.
Gotcha. So it's a mess across the
It
board.
is very much quite a mess, yeah.
It's a mess. Can we? I know you've been dying to talk about this. Can we talk about the concert?
Oh God, the
What's
concert.
what's what's this? What's all this then?
I mean, honestly, I don't know much about the concert, but I just saw on Twitter last night that this sort of occupation has evolved to they have built fully professional stage on Parliament Hill, and they just are inviting people to speak, and you know, it's just ridiculous. Like the way that they're able to just do whatever they want on Parliament Hill in the country's capital. They can build a stage, but if any other, not any other, but if I would say more left-wing protests occurred, they get shut down in hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a famous story from a few years ago. A kid set up a lemonade stand on Parliament Hill to sell lemonade to tourists, and
Mm-hmm.
the police like knocked the lemonade stand down and shut it down
Of course they
fully
did.
within hours. But these people can build a whole stage.
That's so wild to me. I mean, obviously there are a lot of intersecting issues here, and I'm by no
Right.
means like trying to rah rah for the police, but I can't imagine
Sure.
being a police officer or law enforcement official of any kind, seeing this and thinking like I'm supposed to stop this, or maybe that's not what they're thinking.
Right.
But I feel like we've gotten to the point now where the right weaponizes their anger to a point and to an extent, and with such passion, maybe would be the word, that
Hmm.
literally even the police are afraid to interject.
Yeah, I
Partially,
think
I know, I'm
there's
sure because they agree, but
right.
like the idea that we can't contain that energy is scary.
Right. Yeah, the I would say the response from the police and from elected officials at any jurisdiction has been, we don't want to escalate the situation by trying to remove them. And maybe a bunch of young kids who are protesting for Black Lives Matter don't have the same power as a lot of men in huge trucks.
Sure.
It's kind of a different caliber of what they might be capable of versus what different group might be capable of. I think that's kind of a cop out because the rules are the rules and they should be enforced on everyone.
Yeah.
But the other conversation that has been happening is jurisdiction. Who's responsible for getting these people out, and they've kind of just been passing the buck back and forth. And that's also been very frustrating.
Yeah. I it's hard to look at everything that's happening. Like this, the January 6th stuff here in the States, what's happening
Hmm.
now, and seeing how it's spreading around the world. All over a vaccine mandate or
Right.
a testing mandate in this case. And it's like, where did that switch flip? When did we become so detached from like our shared humanity that um, you can point blank say, this pandemic that's killed so many people and is continuing to kill people, I'm over it, and it's no
Right.
longer more important than getting back to work or um, my freedom, my personal
Right.
liberties that are being stomped all over. I
Or
can't.
at least the perception of your freedom.
Right, right. I can't imagine. I try to lead with empathy and think like, what kind of mindset or what kind
Hmm.
of what must someone be going through for that to be the way they think? And I just can't. I can't see it, and it's sad
I
and
mean,
scary as hell because these are people who
I mean,
generally also have a lot of guns and shit. So
right. That is very true. But yeah, like I said earlier, there are a lot of everyday people who, because of fear, are getting roped into these things, and I think the fear is justified in the sense that a lot of public health restrictions come with consequences for the working class. If they shut down restaurants, all those servers are out of work. If anything they shut down, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of workers who aren't able to work, and the government response as time has gone on in the pandemic is to keep the restrictions, but to pull away the benefits that used to come with restrictions. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, we had the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So everything was shut down, but everybody got $2,000 a month. That does
mhm.
not exist anymore, and nothing even close to that exists anymore. So if in extraordinary circumstances another surge of this pandemic happens and we start shutting down again, people are afraid that those same benefits that came before are not going to come again and they're going to be in even harder times. And so that part of it makes sense to me. That genuine fear of this pandemic as it goes on, we're not being helped in the same way we were helped at the beginning of it.
Mhm.
But I think people with more sinister goals are co-opting that fear, and that's kind of the root of the problem.
Gotcha. So I guess my next question would be, as a Canadian who cares about his fellow Canadians and as someone who wants this to come to a peaceful end, what do you see as being the solution? How do we fix this? How do we get them to go home and get back to work? Um,
Oof. That's a big question. Honestly, I don't know.
okay.
I don't, I mean, I have thoughts, but the thoughts are, it's such like big structural changes to the way everything is, like, the way the government operates, the way our society operates, everything. So many things have to change
Mm-hmm.
so that these problems don't even arise. But then where do you even start?
Sure. Sure. I feel like it's like a lose lose situation because we
Right,
could uh, we we being you and I, we're Canada.
right,
Give them what they want, roll back all the mandates, throw everything back to the way it was. Pandemic's over. Congratulations.
right,
But then, like, the kind of standard that sets or the precedent that sets is if you don't like something, this is this changes. This is how you get those changes.
right,
Which on one hand is true. We know that a lot of civil rights in particular have come after
right.
years and years or even generations of protest of all kinds,
Hmm.
and that's, in my opinion, not necessarily what we're looking at here. This isn't an oppressed group advocating for equality or equity. It's a privileged group
Hmm.
whining.
But in the sense that they are copying what they know to have worked in the past, like this is classic civil disobedience, it's mass organization, it's, like they're using all the same tactics that oppressed people have used in the past to get what they need from the government.
Yeah, and that's the shitty thing is that they're
Hmm.
following the playbook, um,
Right,
but only one side gets to use the playbook.
right. Yeah, and that's, I think that's where the frustration of the left, especially on Twitter, is we're seeing these people who are doing what we only dream of being capable of, in a sense. We wish we could
Sure.
have this, insane media attention, international media attention, spark an international movement, but maybe for the right or wrong reasons, depending on what side you're looking at it on.
Yeah. If it was Black Lives Matter shutting down a bridge, especially that
Oh gosh.
bridge,
Hmm.
there would already be casualties. There would already be people dead,
Yeah.
for sure. And
The
none of the changes would be made.
Right. It took them 3 weeks to get an injunction to end these particular blockades. But, in 2020, when the rail blockades were happening, the biggest one that was in Alberta was in Edmonton, and it took 10 hours to fully shut down the blockade and take it down because they got an injunction that day.
Hmm.
So 10 hours versus what we're going on to 3 weeks or close to a month now.
Right. Right. And it feels like it's at the point now because you had mentioned too that specifically in Ontario there are penalties allegedly that will be levied, that people will
Right.
be fined. But it almost feels like they know
Hmm.
that they're not going to actually do those things. I don't know of anybody. I haven't heard that anybody's actually been fined or arrested or prosecuted with anything. And it's very similar, I think, to what we saw with the January 6th insurrection, where like we promised we were going to go after all of them and we're going to prosecute them all to the fullest extent of the law. And then we keep seeing,
Right.
like, yeah, some of them have been, but like there are so many people that still haven't been identified, even let alone seen any kind of justice.
Right.
I hate it.
Yeah. It's wild. And then like again, like it has evolved so much that it's hard to keep up with as an observer or someone who's not really experiencing it directly, but who
Hmm.
may experience the impact later on or just watching. It's so hard to follow and keep up with it. And then of course we have the added layer I'm sure you saw where there were a lot of people who were brandishing things like swastikas and other, symbols of hate and upside down Canada flags and uh so those people intermingled into this movement that's supposed to be about labor rights and about vaccine mandates. It gets really hard to kind of parse out what is, what can I give like air to and what should I completely shut down?
Right, right. And it feels like when we started seeing some of that imagery was when um, steps started getting taken from the government level, where that's when we started to see, like the GoFundMe got shut down. I'm assuming, and they still haven't really specified what specifically within their terms of service this
Right.
fundraiser violated, but I would imagine it probably has something to do with either some of this other energy that's been brought into it, or I also know there was some confusion about who was actually getting all of that money and what was it being
Right.
actually spent on. But yeah, it's the way that the message is kind of not diluted, but it's gotten busier or
Right.
almost buried a little bit in all this other stuff that doesn't deserve that energy and doesn't deserve that attitude or that
Right.
air, as you said. But how do you
But there is
navigate that?
sort of justifiable conversations that are mixed into this whole thing that should be had.
Mm-hmm.
I think even I still support public health restrictions, public health measures to keep people safe, but I think there is a valid conversation to have about where did our governments go wrong in this whole process starting 2 years ago.
Sure.
What did they do wrong? What did they do right? I think that is a very valid conversation, and the people that want to have that conversation are maybe being drowned out by these more sinister people that are co-opting this movement.
Yeah, and I know there's also a conversation to be had about kind of who's backing all of that. Is there a kind
Right.
of more, just like we're having that conversation here in the States about January 6th, like were there people who knew something was happening or that was going to happen? And
Hmm.
are there people who took advantage? Are there people who um, kind of stoked that fire beforehand? I would imagine there will probably be time for a similar conversation uh, regarding what's happening in Canada now. It reminds me a lot
Right.
of when we talk about schools and the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic's fucked us all up. We're all
Right.
totally different now than we were 3 years ago, 2 years ago. Um, and there are a lot of really valid criticisms for the way that we do education, at least here in the States, and the way that
Hmm.
school districts have handled the pandemic. But because there's this very loud, again, very loud minority of people who've kind of taken up this battle about parents' rights and freedoms and liberty and bodily autonomy and all of this,
Right.
we're not getting to have the conversations about like, oh, are we paying teachers enough for all of the work that we ask them to do? Are we properly
Hmm.
staffing our schools? Because we're too busy, getting shit thrown at us for daring to require that people wear masks in the middle of a pandemic. So it
Right.
just gets so messy. And like you said, yeah, people just get lost in the shuffle of it all. It's hard to keep up. Everything moves so quickly. It's hard to know where to get your information from.
Right.
Um, and then it feels like there's some new crisis. It reminds me of like the entire Donald Trump presidency, where it's like there's just some new fire every day. And so we didn't have time to follow up on what happened yesterday because we were too busy panicking about what he said today. Um,
Literally. And I think that bringing up Donald Trump is very relevant to this because if you go and look at all the images from these protests and the videos, you can see like Trump 2020 signs.
mhm.
And you can see like people
He issued a statement, I think, and he supported
yeah,
them. He said, keep it up. These fighters
yeah.
for freedom and stand up. Don't let
Hmm.
the government. Specifically, he seems to not like Justin Trudeau very much.
Right.
He's like, don't let Trudeau take away your liberties.
I think that's really important how I guess the influence of American populism in particular is kind of gaining traction in Canada. Because I would say in the past, like our brand of conservative is very different than America's brand of conservative, but they're starting to kind of blend together, if that makes sense.
Sure, I think that it really when he was inaugurated. I won't say that we elected him because I have my doubts, but
Sure.
um, it feels like that was a sign to a lot of these folks who for years have been on the fringe and don't even have the numbers to be taken seriously in their home countries. They saw, oh, this is an example, like we could win. There's a way for us to win and we can have the power. And so it feels like, especially now that he's out here rooting everybody on, there's this new energy of, if we just fight hard enough, or if we're just loud enough, if we're just abrasive enough, we'll wake everybody up and we'll have the power and we'll get to make the decisions. So yeah, I think that that's something that will ripple for decades, if not longer,
Right.
that we allowed that to happen. And I see it's not talked about. We don't talk about the Freedom Convoy a lot here. I haven't seen it a whole lot. But when I do, there are a lot of folks who like it's like a joke for them where it's like, oh well, finally it's not the United States who did this, or like, oh look, even Canada's got
Right.
their own shit. But it's like, yeah, but even that can kind of be tied, maybe not 100%, but there are certainly parallels, and there are certainly cues that they're taking from similar
No,
movements that have happened here.
I would say maybe in a parallel universe where Trump didn't get elected, this Freedom Convoy wouldn't have had as much
They wouldn't have
of
a
an
blueprint.
impact as it had. Yeah.
Yeah, they
Like,
wouldn't have seen other people do it and have it work.
hmm
And that's
and
what.
the rhetoric that they're using and the messages that they're sending, I think all of that comes from sort of that trajectory of the Trump presidency for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you see it. It works once. It happened once, and for it to happen, here where we pride ourselves on being this bastion of democracy, and
Hmm
the place where if there is any place that the people rule, it is here. Even if it can happen here, then why can't it happen in New Zealand or Belgium or Finland
Right.
or Canada?
hmm
And here we are. It's happening at all of
And
those places at the same time, and we're all fucked.
right. And New Zealand is an interesting example because they've been lauded as like, the country that did the pandemic the best.
Yeah.
Like they have the lowest cases and the lowest death rates, and all of that came with the highest restrictions.
hmm
So it's interesting to see that there are people there that are opposing it, and now they have kind of some wind in their sails, I guess.
hmm Yeah, I think it ties in a lot with the kind of general fatigue that I think we're all feeling about the pandemic. I mean, I would love to be able to just not worry about it anymore too. And I think
Yeah,
it's
fair.
at the point now where people are just, we were told, and I think governments have a stake in this as well, where for a lot of us, the messaging felt like get your vaccine and then the pandemic will be over. That if you got the vaccine,
Right.
you wouldn't have to worry about this anymore. You could not wear a mask wherever you wanted. And that's not turning out to be the case. And so if people are feeling led on by their government, they're feeling lied to, they're feeling like this is all some sort of conspiracy, although I don't know how the government's really benefiting from this like long drawn out pandemic. Corporations sure are, but I
Right.
don't know if the government's really taking this very well. But um,
hmm
yeah, it's a lot, and it's all intertwined.
Nope, at that point of the government has really pushed the idea that, get your vaccine and then we're on the track to, you know, back to normal, whatever that means. And so I can imagine being an unvaccinated person for whatever reason and thinking, I'm the reason why things are not back to normal, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
and feeling a lot of feelings about that. Like whatever those feelings are,
Yeah.
that's it can't feel good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and especially in a world where it's so easy to find information or sources that will validate your feelings, even if
Mhm.
they're wrong. So even if you
Right.
even
Yeah,
if
yeah.
even if you're wrong in saying that like the vaccine is a microchip that the government's trying to get
Right.
implanted in your arm, you can find what might look like really reputable sources that will confirm that for you.
Right.
I mean, scroll on any Facebook timeline and you're likely to find any number of vaccine injury stories or government conspiracies and
Right.
5G.
It all just it's just like the algorithm, whatever side of the internet you're on,
Yeah.
everything seems real to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even I've been over the course of this 3 weeks, like, I mean, you've seen my Twitter feed. It's been a lot of
You've been real unhinged,
frustration
girl. Let's be honest. Something has
because
changed, and you all of a sudden have no chill.
because being a queer person, and being someone who is very much a leftist and being a part of like Black Lives Matter and indigenous protests for land defenders, and then seeing this happen, it's been so frustrating. And so I've wanted to like paint everybody on this side of this protest with one brush, but of course I've had to have some introspection and think that it's a lot more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and then of course seeing like Nazi imagery and swastikas and all these hate symbols and knowing that there are so many people in my community who feel so unsafe in Ottawa right now or wherever these protests are happening, it's frustrating. And so I have kind of painted everybody on that side on with one brush, but of course it is more complicated than that.
Sure, there's nuance to everything.
Right.
So I guess maybe a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
Also, I know you have some resources you wanted to share, so feel free to drop those whenever you would like.
hmm
I think it's always important to make sure we're trying to share verified resources. I was gonna say valid resources, verified resources when we have them, but So you are someone who has an interest in working in politics as a living. You've run for office. I imagine you probably will run for office again at some point. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Seeing the state of affairs in Alberta, in Canada, in the world, uh, seeing how messy everything is, seeing and knowing that there aren't necessarily easy solutions really to any of these problems, what motivates you to uh, keep showing up in those spaces, especially as a
Ooh.
third party candidate who do you struggle to even get a seat at the table sometimes? What is it that keeps
Right.
you going in the face of all of that? That's a heavy ass question. I just thought of it. I thought it was pretty good.
That is. No, I mean, I think I'll be 100% honest and say I'm still struggling with it. Um, like finding the energy to be involved in politics when I largely feel like it's broken and I can't fix it, and the things that I believe in, there's no space for them. I often feel that sometimes. But I think specifically my role in the Green Party now as someone who's responsible for youth and young people and making sure that our voices are heard, that's what kind of keeps bringing me back because I want to make sure that young people have a voice in politics and doing everything I can to make sure that they're engaged and that they show up because I think, we could be, as a demographic, young people could be just as powerful as the demographic that typically tends out to get to the polls and gets to vote and gets to decide who is in the government. And we don't often leverage that power that we have just demographically, just, running the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
We could have a huge impact and we don't yet. And I want to be part of getting people engaged and getting them out to the polls, young people especially, and just empowering them. However that looks to them, I just want to help kind of bring that forward.
Awesome. I love that. And kudos to you because I even trying to keep up just watching the news or reading things
Right.
it makes me want to throw myself out a window off a cliff into a river. I can't imagine what it's like to be. I think specifically I see a lot of folks who are in local government who really one where that's where a lot of these conversations are starting. That's where a lot of these restrictions are happening. It's town level, it's state level,
Right.
province, leadership that's making a lot of these decisions. And often they're positions where I know here, for example, like our school boards, typically that's not a paid position, that's a volunteer position, or you're paid like $1,000 for a year of service.
Right.
And so it's people who are doing this work generally for free or for very little pay.
Mhm.
And similarly, I think they just want to make a difference and want to leave the world better than when they got here. And it's often those folks who take the brunt of the abuse and the ridicule too. So thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate it.
Oh,
On
well,
behalf of the children of Alberta,
know.
we thank you.
Oh, the WMDA.
We are the
We
future.
thank you. Um,
Yeah. But if there's
I mean,
anything
one
else
thing,
when you want to touch on,
um, just that, like I mentioned earlier about the Wet'suwet'en and Indigenous protests, and I just want to kind of say that I'm not the authority on Indigenous anything because I'm not Indigenous, and
sure.
so I think in listening to that conversation and trying to be engaged in those issues, I think everyone listening should try to find the facts from the source. So I encourage everyone to, listen to Indigenous people tell their own story and not just listen to what I've had to say and kind of take that to heart, but to find other sources and get it directly from the source because that's really important. The bread and butter of colonization is removing those voices from being able to tell their own story. So, don't just listen to me, find the information from the source and let them tell their own story.
Yeah. Yeah. And amplify it. I think that's one thing that a lot of
Yes.
us who have privilege in one regard or another, we miss that step where, yes, learn from, listen to, and educate yourself based on information and resources from the communities most impacted, but then also understand that there's a responsibility as someone with a voice that some people will listen to more than those folks.
Right.
It's your job to amplify that message. And I think sometimes we skip that step because we then make ourselves vulnerable to whatever backlash there might be. I'm less likely to share
Right.
that kind of shit with my social networks because I don't want to deal with the conservative Trumpsters that might still somehow be in my network somewhere. But that's part of what using your privilege looks like. Having those hard conversations.
Totally.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to add, to share? What do we need to know?
Um, I don't know. I think we kind of hit all like the really major points and the major concerns. I guess it's still a developing issue. Like it's still happening. We're not talking about something that is over.
Sure. Yeah.
The protests are ongoing, so I encourage everyone to kind of still pay attention and follow along. Um, Maybe organize a counter protest of sorts of your own or something in your community to kind of engage and inform people. Talk with your neighbors, talk with your friends. Um, yeah, just inform yourself and understand what they're asking for and how you feel about it, and you know, maybe come together and say, how can we move forward?
Yeah. What are the odds this is going to keep me from being able to come to the gay rodeo in Calgary?
Um, I don't think it's that bad because the government also announced yesterday that they're removing the some requirement for international travel. So
Oh,
it's
well.
actually easier to travel internationally now.
Okay, well, I just won't be able to take those
Yeah,
bridges. It sounds like
right.
I'll have to,
Yeah,
have to fly in. Well,
yeah.
very interesting.
No driving. Oh my God, can you imagine if they're still there months from now?
I can't imagine. I mean, kudos to them, I guess, for being that passionate about something if they're able to do that. I can't imagine what
Sure.
I would have to be like, what would have to happen for me to be like, I am not leaving this very spot for 6 months, eight
Yeah,
months. But never say never. It's a wild world we live in. I've learned in the last
true.
4 years, never count anything out. It could happen to you. It could happen to you. It could happen to me. It could happen to any of us. And I will not allow myself
That
to
was
be
so
surprised
cryptic.
anymore.
It could
Yeah,
happen to
it could happen
you.
to you. The Freedom Convoy could happen to you.
Well, oh God. I wish someone would free my convoy.
Oh!
Oh, and we're bringing it back.
Oh my God.
Remember, we're still
Well,
rotted. Even if we can have hard conversations, we're still rotted queers.
yeah, at our core,
Yeah.
we were born this way. Well, thank you
Mhm.
so much. This was a really good conversation. We will have plenty more
Yeah.
conversations like this. So if you're watching this live here on Twitch, let us know in chat what you want us to cover in the future. It could be what's happening right now in the world. It could be uh, something that's happened in the past. It could be pop culture
Mhm.
shit. What is it that you have heard about? What is it that you're vaguely familiar with and you want us to talk about it so you can learn a little bit more? I'm hearing a lot about Ukraine right now. I'm hearing a lot about uh, more pandemic stuff. I learned yesterday Paris Hilton's doing NFTs, and my heart broke into a million little pieces and fell on the floor. We could try to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, let's do it.
If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment and let us know what are some of the topics that are at the forefront of your brain, and we'll see if we can cover them for you. On
I'm
that
so
note,
excited.
thank you all so much for watching. Austin, thank you as always. Let's do it again sometime.
Can't wait.
Yeah. Play the music. Oh no, my Stream Deck has the buttons labeled the same way, so we're gonna hope this is the right one. Hey.